Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar. I am your host, Valerie Elg, Activities Manager at the CAT School. You will hear from John Bandler, lawyer, author, and cybersecurity expert in discussion with Howard Schiffman. John Bandler recently authored the book Cybersecurity for the Home and Office, The Lawyer's Guide to Taking Charge of Our Own Information Security, a comprehensive guide for readers of every technical skill level. He teaches and speaks about cybersecurity, cybercrime, money laundering, criminal justice, and other topics, and has authored articles on these subjects as well. He founded a law firm and consulting firm to help clients with the many threats and risks they face. He entered the private sector a few years ago after spending over 20 years in law enforcement as a prosecutor and police officer. Also joining us today is Howard Schiffman. Howard is a graduate from Boston University, Suffolk University Law School, George Washington University Law School, University of Wales, Cardiff School of Law, and he also is a senior U.S. Fulbright Scholar in New Zealand. Howard is currently the director of the graduate program in data and privacy law. And now let's learn from John and Howard.
Okay, thank you, Valerie, for that nice introduction, and thank you for all of our attendees today. We know we have a number of our admitted students that are listening. We have a number of people listening who are contemplating applying to our program, as well as other people simply interested in the topic of cybersecurity, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. We're very happy to have John today. Let me just say a bit about our program. So the Master's of Studies in Law, that's the M.S.L degree, is a brand new enterprise of the Cardozo Law School here at Yeshiva University. We're enrolling our first class now. And this is a fully online program. It's 30 credits. One can do it either full-time or part-time, depending on your schedule. If you want to proceed rapidly to graduation, it's about a year. If you want to go part-time, you can do one credit a semester, one class a semester. Whatever fits your schedule. There's no time to graduation that's required. We're recruiting our fall class now and accepting applications. And one of the big questions that we get all the time is, do you need previous knowledge of computer science? The answer is a resounding no. Do you need any background in law? And the answer is a resounding no. We're going to teach you everything you need. All you really need is an undergraduate degree with demonstrating excellence and interest in graduate work in data and privacy law, and a genuinely abiding interest. You got to show us that you really want to work in this field and that you can see a place for yourself in this field, and tell us why you think that's the case. And that's what's necessary to join us. Okay, thank you so much. So without further ado, we're going to go on to our discussion with John today. As you heard, we have a very exciting guest who has a broad background in as a prosecutor, as a law enforcement official, as an author, and now a lawyer in private practice. And he's going to be telling us about his career. He's going to tell us about where he sees the field going and where the opportunities will be for people, especially those who have the M.S.L in data privacy law. So, John, why don't you start by telling us a little about your education?
Thanks for having me here. It's great to be here with you, Howard, and thanks for tuning in and listening, everybody. So I started a long time ago, it seems, but I went to Hamilton College, got a Bachelor of Arts. So even though Bachelor of Arts, a little bit of a tech background or scientific background, as I majored in physics, a minor in computer science. I also did ROTC in college and ended up getting my commission, but working in a technical software company for a little bit. And then I joined the state police. I know we're talking about some of my jobs a little later, but I went back to school after some time in the state police, and I went to law school. I got my JD and then started working as a lawyer. So aside from that formal education, I've done a lot of self-study. especially as I started getting into the field of cybersecurity. So I've studied for a number of certifications. You see a couple of them up there on the screen. You got that CISSP, which stands for Certified Information System Security Professional. It's administered by a nonprofit organization called ISC Squared, and that's one of the leading cybersecurity certifications out there. It covers a broad range of domains about securing your information. And it's not just about that technical stuff of protecting against a data breach, but it's pretty holistic about how to protect information. That certification even covers things like fire protection and making sure you have power, electricity to keep the computers running, and adequate physical barriers to keep people out of sensitive areas and where your computers are. Some of those other security certifications listed that have those pluses after them, those are from CompTIA, Computer Technology Industry Association, I think is what that stands for. But those are a more accessible set of certifications. That Security Plus is kind of a scaled down version of the CISSP. Cloud Plus is like it sounds, about how to manage data and software and services that are up in the cloud, not stored locally on your companies or your own servers that are local. That Network Plus is a technical certification, how networks work, gets into the nitty-gritty of that. And the A Plus is kind of an entry-level technical support type certification. And yeah, I'm proud of those, because as a lawyer, to be able to pass that test on those technical exams, not every lawyer can do that. And I got another certification, CIPP, Information Privacy Professional, and that's from the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, which is a nice overview of privacy law and this growing field of privacy.
Great. Okay. So tell us about your jobs. Again, we're featuring what I think is a stellar career here as a sort of a model that one can follow. So he's telling us about his early positions leading up to his present work. So tell us about your jobs before you became a lawyer.
Sure. So after college, I went into software technical support, and I was kind of waiting for, I was trying to go active duty in the military, but the military was shrinking at that time. I was a reserve officer, and then I was applying for police officer jobs, and New York State Police called. So I joined the state police. I served in Middletown, New York, which is one of the busiest state police stations in the state. And I was there for about 4 years when I started going to law school part-time. And then 4 years later, going part-time, I graduated and joined the Manhattan DA's office.
Great. So we'll talk more about that later. John's going to tell you he was lead counsel on one of the very first cybersecurity cases in New York. We'll get to that in a second. I think you'll find that story quite gripping. But tell us about what motivated you to enter the field of cybersecurity.
So as a prosecutor, I was in an identity theft unit, and then one case led into cybercrime, and I was involved in these cybercrime cases, and one cybercrime case in particular, for almost a decade. And I got this look at the cybercrime economy and all the participants in that illicit economy that were doing the data breaches, selling the data, the identity thieves, and how they're buying the data and using it to victimize people. And from fighting cybercrime as a prosecutor, investigating it, trying to catch the bad guys and gals, it seemed like a natural extension to use what I learned to help companies, to help individuals protect themselves from cybercrime happening with cybersecurity and fraud awareness is one way to do that, and also to help them investigate it after it happens, because it's a new area and a lot of the private sector is not caught up, and the government certainly has not caught up to all the risks and threats that are there. And I think there's a need for people like me.
So the cyber crime is evolving. Again, this is also something we'll talk about in a bit. But so we may have started off with these scams where somebody is trying to just get information from you, right, in order to access your bank account. Maybe that just give us your bank account information, and we're trying to liberate some funds in a foreign country, and you'll get a portion of that. To things that are just much more sophisticated than that today. And this is why there's a need for bright and innovative professionals in this field. So taking you back to the time that you were in Morgenthal's office, the New York County DA's, you prosecuted one of the first significant cybercrime cases in New York. And this was before a time when something like email could easily come into evidence, right? So what did you tell us about what that experience was like?
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. And, this was before people were writing about data breaches all the time, before people were talking about Bitcoin. In fact, Bitcoin wasn't even around, but people didn't even know about virtual currency, which a lot of people don't realize was around. Virtual currency was invented in the 90s. And this case started out, I was a junior prosecutor. I had about 3 years of experience as a prosecutor, and an identity theft complaint came in. One person's credit card was used to fraudulently purchase merchandise, and the merchandise was being shipped to an address in Manhattan. Cross-referencing that address with other merchants, you realize these were dozens of frauds being committed, $40,000, which seemed like a lot to me at the time to have a fraud case of $40,000. But it turned out that address in Manhattan was just a reshipper, kind of sort of like a mule. And he was certainly not the mastermind of this. He said he was buying the merchandise, he thought, using digital currency. E-gold, the first digital currency, and that's what he was using. And as a junior prosecutor, my question was, what's e-gold and how is that possible? But I started investigating the flow of the money through e-gold, and if there's something we know, it's that criminals who are successful make a lot of money. They need to be able to pay each other. They need to be able to launder their money. So I started looking at the flow of the money that these criminals had received for this merchandise. It led to an exchanger, a digital currency exchanger in Manhattan called Western Express. And they were in Manhattan. They were at the forefront of virtual currency, doing exchange business. We started looking at the company and their customers. They were doing illegal check cashing, illegal money transmitting. And as we dug into it much deeper, we saw they were facilitating payments between identity thieves in the United States and cyber criminals in Eastern Europe. Identity thieves need to buy that stolen data. Cyber criminals hack that data, they steal it, and then they sell it to identity thieves. So we were looking at these payments. We ended up indicting 5 cyber criminals from Eastern Europe and extraditing 3 of those 5, which is a tremendous success rate. One was a Ukrainian who sold stolen credit card data, and you can't extradite from Ukraine, but he's got so much money he needs to vacation somewhere. He was vacationing in Greece in the island of Rhodes, and we were able to get the Greek authorities to arrest him, eventually extradited him. There were 2 criminals from Moldova and Russia, but they were living in the Czech Republic. We were able to arrest and extradite them. So it worked out great, but it took a long time. The Ukrainian cyber criminal ended up going to trial. 2 of the identity thieves they happened to be from Brooklyn. They went to trial too. So this trial went for 2.5 months, and they were found guilty on every count. And it was just a tremendous case, and I'm glad I did it, but it's one of those things you wouldn't want to go through again.
As you recount that story, two things strike me. Is that the investigation, the prosecution lasted nearly a decade. It was one that began my own career in the criminal courts of New York State as well. That's just unprecedented. I mean, it's very rare to have cases like that. I wouldn't say unprecedented, but very rare to have cases that last that long. Usually, the investigation and then the arrest and then the pretrial and then the trial. And usually, we're talking within a year or so that all of that happens. And for this to go on that long really is quite a testament to the determination of the prosecutors who worked on that case. Sounds like you definitely broke ground on that. The other part that struck me is the length of time it took you to actually acquire the defendants in that case, that you had to wait for them actually to enter an area where you had extradition, because there's no extradition outside of treaty, and you have to wait until their physical presence is in a country that will actually extradite them. So that's really just fascinating. Okay, so we're moving along here. So since then, tell us about what you've done since then. How's your career taken off since then?
So after that trial, and part of the reason the case took so long is, a year or 2 years for an extradition, and there were some legal issues, including we charged these defendants with being part of organized crime, and New York State courts ultimately disagreed about that. They said this is not organized crime as they see it, because this is an arm's length capitalist thing. So I founded a cybercrime intelligence unit at the DA's office using some of the, what I learned in this case, the importance about having good intelligence to be able to prove who did something online. I left the DA's office. I entered private practice. I created a law firm and a consulting practice, and I help companies with cybersecurity. I help individuals too. I help them with investigating cybercrime that they've been a victim of. I like helping clients, and of course, I end up helping a lot of friends and family with their issues too, although that doesn't pay as well. In fact, it doesn't pay at all. But it's nice to be able to help. When you work at the DA's office, they let you know that the government owns you, and they don't want you freelancing. They don't want any complications. So I was able to write that book about cybersecurity. I teach at a couple a college and a law school, and I write and try to lend my subject matter expertise whenever I can to interesting projects.
Great. So some of the issues that you work on now, why don't you enlighten us about that?
So organizations have to have a information security program, also known as a cybersecurity program. A lot of times people don't understand the difference between those two terms, cybersecurity and information security. And regulations are coming to that, and that means companies that weren't thinking about their information security program, even if they should have been thinking about it before, now they're thinking about it because there's a regulation or a legal risk, and that's spurring them to do something. So I help companies with that to ensure they're complying with regulations, but I also try to help them to ensure they're adequately considering the risks they're facing, not just from regulation, but the actual risk of the crime. So a lot of people who are victims of cybercrime, many more than the statistics would bear out. A lot of cybercrime does not go reported. So victims need help, and a lot of times if they call the police or the DA's office or the FBI, the response may not be what you might expect if you were the victim of a traditional crime like a burglary or your car is stolen. The cops will come and take a report and do the minimum. But with cybercrime, it's hard to get government to do that, and I can help with that. So the cases may be a data breach, someone's was hacked, they're a victim of fraud or theft. A big fraud going around today, it's called business email compromise. So someone's email account has been hacked. They don't know it. And that email account is used to divert funds. So think if you're going to get wiring instructions because you're buying a house or a legal settlement, and if the person sending you those wiring instructions has had their account hacked, that's an opportunity to misdirect those funds, and it's more common than people realize. And with the internet, people are using those internet platforms to threaten people, death threats, online harassment. So I've been able to help people with that too. So interesting cases, similar to what I worked on as a prosecutor, a little bit different resources and angle. And of course, with cybercrime, money is stolen. It could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. It's very hard to go after the cyber criminal. But another thing to look at is, was someone else negligent in allowing that cybercrime to happen and that money to be stolen? So that's something I help clients evaluate.
And if someone was negligent, it may mean that there's a potential remedy against that party that was negligent, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's a new area of law, and but it's going to become a more frequent issue.
I would think that's going to become very big. Any other remedies? And we're going to have a question and answer period later, but I thought I just might ask, because you certainly piqued my curiosity in talking about some of the remedies that might be available for cybercrime victims. Could you just say a little bit about that now?
Absolutely. And cyber insurance, you hear a lot about lately. Certainly, insurance companies love to sell a new product, and they'll tell potential customers, that some of the existing insurance products may not cover from certain cybercrime. So if a company loses $1 million through this business email compromise scheme I mentioned, the insurance company a lot of times may say, not covered under your policy. They'll want to sell a new policy. So different people are buying insurance coverage for this to protect them from some of this liability. And the insurance recognizes the potential for liability. So, insurance is one way that individuals and companies can transfer some of that risk, transfer some of that liability, so that they won't have to pay out of their pocket. The insurance company will pay for them. But basically, I think what we're going to see is a growing area of law and risk, where people are trying to protect themselves from this liability for cybercrime, buy insurance. And of course, when there's insurance, sometimes the insurance company doesn't get paid. So now there's a dispute between the client and the insurance company about what should be covered and what is not covered. But with all this cybercrime and the data being breached, there's a new industry of people and lawyers and insurance companies trying to apportion that loss, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
That will be interesting, and for the purpose of our students and potential students in our program, that suggests that the insurance industry is probably a good place where they might be employed. We'll talk about that in a bit. But let's talk about your book. So you recently published this book. It's a major work. I think will be a major work. It was recently your publisher is the American Bar Association, if I'm correct, on cybersecurity for the home and office. And tell us about what your motivation for it was, what you attempt to do in the book.
I was very fortunate to be able to write the exact book I wanted to write, and it came up a little by happenstance. I saw in an email, someone from the book publishing board asked if anyone was interested in writing a book on cybersecurity for the home. And with my kind of hands-on knowledge of computers and doing technical support for my parents for, quite some time, and seeing how people are victimized, I thought this was the perfect book for me. And including with my self-study for these certifications, I tried to put that in a usable format for the reader, that they can learn about computers, learn about networks, learn about information security, learn about what cyber criminals are trying to do, learn about these other privacy threats from all of these companies that offer us services for free. And of course, Facebook's been in the news and is an example of that, and internet advertising, and how companies that are ostensibly legitimate, although some are not, are monetizing data. So it's a book for people to take charge of their own cybersecurity, take charge of their own privacy. And the analogy I like to use is that if people know how to secure their house by locking their front door at night or locking their windows, if people know how to get in their car and lock the car doors and put on their seatbelt and stop at a red light, people need to learn the same about their devices, their computers. They need to know where their data is stored and how to secure their data. They need to learn a little bit about their networks and how to secure their networks. And that requires education and knowledge, because we can't have common sense if we don't have that foundation of knowledge. And that cybersecurity is something we can all do in our home. First priority is our home, our family. And once you've done that, and you can do that on a hands-on basis in your home, because that's within our skill set, all of that knowledge and those skills can translate to the workplace. And even if you're in a huge organization and it has its own IT department and information security department, having that knowledge helps you understand what they're doing and trying to do. And if you understand how to control your own data, I think it gives you a good perspective if you're working in a company trying to help that company come up with, say, a privacy policy that employees can actually understand and follow.
Okay. So how do you see this field changing? I know no one can predict several years out, but what are some of the trends and directions that you see?
One thing that hits me is how what we're doing now just does not work. The cybercrime, I call it an epidemic, but the hundreds of billions of dollars that are stolen, the data breaches that, when you think about it, are really unanswered, because if you look at the number of cyber criminals that are arrested and extradited each year, it's minuscule compared to the amount of cybercrime that's happening. And with that cybercrime, it's an attack on data. Companies, whether it's the Equifax data breach, whether it's Facebook, and maybe that's not a data breach, maybe they leaked data or allowed Cambridge Analytica to access this data in violation of their privacy policy, or certainly a lot of Facebook users weren't aware of it. Government breaches where government data is being stolen, like that OPM breach. What's clear is our country is not addressing it properly yet, and it's got to learn how to. If you look at these data breach laws, every state has their own data breach notification law. There's no unifying federal standard. That makes it very confusing for companies to try navigate that. These insurance products are increasing. People are buying insurance. Now they have to comply with what they've told the insurance company they're going to do. If there's a claim and they're not complying with what they told insurance they're doing, they may have to eat that loss. There's going to be more and more lawsuits. You have a privacy policy, and if you're not following the privacy policy, you can be subject to a lawsuit or a regulatory action. And I don't know how many of you have read privacy policies. We agree to them every day. We click, yes, I've read the privacy policy. Those privacy policies are 15 pages long. I'd be surprised if a lot of companies, employees understand their own company's privacy policies. I think we have to get to a point where privacy and cybersecurity gets a little bit standardized, that we recognize that each company has a duty, some kind of minimum duty to be secure, to respect the privacy of their customers. And I think when companies fall short of that, I think there should be some consequences to that. And, there's going to be more laws passed with each outrageous data breach. There's an uproar, and lawmakers propose something, and sometimes that's a good thing. But I think if we look at the history of other areas of risk and litigation, sometimes it's that civil liability risk that causes companies to take things more seriously.
Sure, that's great. Apropos of that, in terms of directions, for those of us who try to read the tea leaves and often know what kind of a futile effort that can be, if you listen to Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress a few weeks ago, you could hear in some of the questions that he was asked by legislators about where they're thinking about possible future legislation. Could it be the idea of an information fiduciary, or other requirements? But these are things that we're probably going to see down the line. Now, as you said, in varying degrees, individual states, American states, have this legislation. Will we see something like this at the federal level? That remains to be seen. It's going to be very hard, I think, to have a coordinated standard. One thing we do know is that Europe has this coming on, and we're talking next week, really, right? The GDPR, the General Data Privacy Law, which is going to be part of EU law, and it's a very comprehensive law that not only governs European companies that deal with data, but American companies that do business in Europe or exchange or trade in data or somehow use data. So this is coming on, and this is going to affect American companies, and it's here. It's we no longer have a runway to prepare for this. Companies have to be prepared. So in terms of jobs, I mean, where do you see the jobs for people in this field?
Lawyers always like to claim a monopoly on almost everything, but fortunately, they don't have a monopoly on everything. And though we're a nation of laws, we can't have everyone being a lawyer. I think it would not be good for society if everyone was a lawyer. I think there's plenty of jobs for people, even if they're not lawyers. And if you look at a lot of companies, their compliance departments, their is not necessarily all lawyers. I think things like privacy and security are things that need to be built into an organization, not something that just the legal department understands, where lawyers write long and complicated policies or procedures on how things should be, which are, unfortunately, lawyers a lot of times write things in a complicated way. And that's unfortunate. But I think this is an area that needs to be baked into organizations, not just legal, not just privacy departments, but throughout the entire organization, including the lines of business. Now, while I'm on that topic of separate departments, what happens a lot in organizations is they get siloed. So you have a legal department that handles one thing, a compliance department that handles another thing. You have different people in doing different things in compliance, handling things related to different regulations. And a lot of times they get siloed. They're not talking to each other. I think we need to look at cybersecurity and privacy as something you consider from the start, and that is baselined across the whole organization. And you don't want different areas not being able to talk to each other or communicate with each other. So if you have cybersecurity specialists in your information security department, and they're the only ones that understand cybersecurity well, and then you got the legal department, and they're the only ones who are dealing with the regulators, and if they're not talking to each other properly, if they don't have that cross training necessary, which a lot of times they don't have, that's a problem for the organization. So we need to baseline this, and there's room for people in these fields. Even if you're not the cybersecurity expert, even if you're not the lawyer, we have to develop a common understanding.
Thanks. So within the context of what you just said, I was just scribbling some notes here. So there's going to be a need for people do trainings, right? So people with backgrounds in education really could apply this, right? If they have knowledge of security and education, they're able to do some of these trainings to get different parts of a company or an organization up to speed on what the privacy policy is and the importance of it. Yeah, no, that is quite useful. Within corporations, now one is seeing the job title more and more of data information privacy officer, right? This is usually within the executive suite, there'll be somebody with the title of chief information officer, right? And then that person will have a staff, and they will largely be responsible for many of these structures, right? For many of these functions.
Absolutely. And sometimes that's motivated by regulations and legal threats, and they're recognizing privacy is important. And you mentioned GDPR in Europe. That's something companies in the US are very worried about because they don't want to run afoul of that European regulation. And I think more is coming to the US because more regulation and law, because people are fed up with that. And that means companies need to create these positions. And my hope is they don't just do it to check the box and comply with the regulator, but also to infuse it into the whole company across all business lines.
Yeah, and the fines are steep for GDPR non-compliance, if I'm not mistaken, right? Okay, so we have these job titles, and so we build on this. So we have within the field of information governance, we have information security analysts, officers. We have these certifications that you talked about. Within IT departments throughout, there'll be need for people who understand this. Legal departments, as you said, all lines of business, and certainly in the consumer protection field. And we also mentioned insurance as being another big area where you're going to see this. So for those who are considering studying in our program that leads to the M.S.L, the Master of Studies in Law in Data and Privacy Law, who may be considering career in cybersecurity, what advice might you have for them?
So your knowledge, you should always be trying to increase your knowledge, whether you're keeping up to date with current events and trends and reading the news and seeing what new laws are being proposed and talking with people in the field. I think it's very important to meet people in the field, talk with them, ask them what they're doing. Do they like what they're doing? What do they not like? What recommendations would they have for you? And there's another name for that, meeting, talking with people. It's networking. But that's a good way to figure out what might appeal to you, and what opportunities there might be there. Certainly improving your education, either through formal education or studying for certifications, is helpful too. I think with cybersecurity becoming a regulatory requirement, a legal requirement, you don't necessarily have to have that deep technical background, because there's a need to translate that technical into the practical and the legal, into policy and procedure. I think sometimes, as I mentioned, there's that divide between the experts who know that technical very well, and then how it gets to filters out to the masses, so to speak. And I also think that cybersecurity is something that needs to go across the spectrum. It's not just for the experts and specialists to do. It's something every person is going to have a responsibility for. So I think the field is going to increase. I think it's still kind of something that a lot of companies, unfortunately, would rather not have to deal with. But I think good companies and companies that want to survive and do well will look at their cybersecurity and privacy portfolio and try to appropriately minimize their risks and address things, not wait for the catastrophe to happen.
Great. So it's probably be fair to say, I think you'd agree with me that one doesn't only need to be a learner, need to learn in this field, but they need to be a learner. They need to be able to acquire new skills as things go, right?
Definitely. And if you are not technically minded, I would not let that discourage you, because one example I use is when I was prosecuting and investigating cybercrime, some of the best cybercrime analysts did not come from the technical background. They came from the more liberal arts background. They were good at language. They were good at logic. So, and also there were people who came from a very highly technical background, and they were overconfident that that gave them what they needed, and it didn't necessarily make them good at cybercrime investigation. And I think the same goes with cybersecurity. Don't feel intimidated if you're not a technical expert, and don't feel overconfident if you are a technical expert, because it takes a broad range of knowledge and skills to succeed.
That really is an excellent point. So I'm going to ask at this point, we do have some further discussion points. If you have a question now, I see we already have a question queued up for us. And Val, if you're with us, you can help us with that. But if you are in the audience and you'd like to submit a question for John, if you want to ask about the program, if you want to ask about John's career, about his book, about the cases he's worked on, anything at all, you can submit that question now. So you can use the chat feature on your computer to do that. And Val, did you want to take it from here to address read us that first question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Howard. Yeah, there is one question here from our attendees. So John, I think this relates to the case study or the case that you were talking about earlier. Did you try to cooperate with police authorities from the countries which are not extradited criminals, or you just wait for the criminal visits the countries with extradite criminals?
It's a great question. So the whole international aspect of cybercrime makes it tough, because getting cooperation from another country is hard. So we went through the Department of Justice's Office of International Affairs, and they are kind of the official portal to another country. So to get records, we went through them, and think of it as an international subpoena, but they basically make a request to the other country. There's kind of a patchwork of treaties and laws between our country and other countries. So as far as extraditing a criminal, it depends on what country they're in and if they're a citizen of that country. So Ukraine, for example, according to the treaty and Ukraine law, Ukraine will not extradite, right? They will not extradite a Ukrainian citizen to the US, no matter what. So we knew we could not extradite this person from Ukraine. So we were waiting for him to travel, and we did not let him know he was indicted. And when he did travel, we found out, we got him in Greece, and Ukraine did cooperate with doing a search warrant on his house. So that they would do, but according to their law, no extradition. Russia won't extradite, which is why you've seen in the news a lot of these Russians. The U.S. has waited till they travel to a country that's friendly to that, like Greece, France. There's a number of countries. And that's kind of good, because a lot of those countries that will extradite are the places that millionaires like to party. So it kind of stops them from partying as well as they would like to.
I can just give a quick little primer in international law 101 here. And that is a very typical feature of an extradition treaty, that a country will not extradite its own nationals. In fact, I can tell you the U.S. will not be party to an extradition treaty unless it has that, because we don't like to extradite our own nationals either. So that's fairly common throughout. But this larger field of extradition law, which is very, very relevant to cybersecurity, is what we call jurisdiction to enforce. And that is, not only do you have to have a basis in law, what we call jurisdiction to prescribe, in order to be able to apply law to somebody, but you have to secure the presence of the individual to bring them into the justice system. And to do that, you need a few things to line up, right? So you have to be able to have the cooperation of law enforcement to acquire that person and to send them. And that is entirely a product of an extradition treaty. right? So you have to have the cooperation of the government, and you have to have the judicial process within that country to be willing to send that person back. And there's usually, when an extradition is launched, as the Justice Department, their offer of International Affairs Office, when these are launched, it then triggers usually a set of rights in the home country where that person is, and they can raise certain defenses in their country, one of which is that they're not the person named in the indictment. It's mistaken identity, or they weren't in the country at the time that was happened. And since we're talking about a cyber world, what does that even mean, right? You can commit the crime sitting in Ukraine. You never even have to set foot in American soil. So even that presents some murky issues here. But this is an area where we're going to see more and more refinement in the law on this. And I think treaty law is going to follow this as well. For those of you who are interested in the international aspects of this, there's a lot of room for growth and development in the law here. Now, just some additional questions, I think, and I think Val may be working on some additional questions that people are submitting at this point. But John, what coursework do you see would be useful for somebody, whether they do our master's in studies in law or similar study? What coursework is useful for somebody who wants to enter this field?
So, looking at your portfolio of courses, there's one on information governance, which I think is great, and I've actually had Adam Cohen come speak to my law course, and he's actually opened my eyes to a number of things with his expertise in e-discovery and how that fits in with cybersecurity and privacy, which is that a lot of companies really have, and people too, have trouble with all the information they're storing and all the reasons we need to properly administer all this information we store. With privacy policies, it's about what data are you collecting and storing, and when do you delete it and when do you share it. With cybersecurity, it's what data do you have? Are you supposed to be keeping it all? Are you backing it up? Are you keeping it with the adequate level of security to make sure it's available to you and make sure it remains confidential? With e-discovery, which is the people suing each other and trying to get information from other companies in the course of that litigation, the e-discovery field is keeping the data you need to keep, but not keeping the data that you have no need to keep, and that is going to be harmful to you in some type of litigation. So I think information governance is an area that's going to become more and more important, but that most companies do not do well.
Okay, thanks. We actually do have another question here. Earlier, you alluded to the difference between cybersecurity and information security, and you said there was a difference. Maybe we could take this time to explore that a little bit now.
Think of information security as the broader discipline, and cybersecurity is kind of within information security and dealing with network attacks or things going through the internet. So the buzzword today is cybersecurity. Everyone says cybersecurity, but I think people should think information security. An example of this confusion is New York State came out with a new regulation for financial services company. They called it a cybersecurity regulation. And in the regulation, they say cybersecurity 75 times, and they really only say information security one time. But when you look at all the things that regulation tells companies, financial institutions that they must do, it's really about information security. And information security, this broad discipline, and it's about keeping the information confidential that's supposed to be confidential. It's about keeping information accurate that's supposed to be accurate, the integrity of it. And it's about keeping your information available to you when you need it. Imagine if your data or your systems were to go down and all of a sudden you have no access to it. That would shut companies down. So information security is this broad field. Cybersecurity is more narrow. Think network attacks. but practically you can't convince the world to change how they use words. So I always like to call it cybersecurity and information security. I put that all together, and that covers everything regardless of what people's perception might be.
Great, terrific. So with regard to these policies, you mentioned that a lot of the privacy policies that we're just asked to click on, and I know myself, I'm guilty of this as anyone else, I want to launch whatever product that I have, and I just, will click on it without reading the privacy policy. But what if we were to read them? I mean, just what in broad strokes? I mean, what would they include? Are we giving up permission to the company to use our data in a certain way, or I mean, what would actually be in them if we drill down?
So if we were to read them, and I quote to this study in the book, if we were to read them, prepare to devote about a month of your life each year just to reading them. There was a study about 10 years ago that if you were to read every privacy policy, it would take you almost that long. And that was 10 years ago, before lawyers started lengthening them. So in that 15-page privacy policy, it's hard to know what they might say. It might say, by agreeing to this, you agree to give us all your data and we'll use it in perpetuity and we'll share it with anyone. And that's part of the problem of US law and why we need people in organizations who are actually willing to read these privacy policies to alert us to what's in there. We probably need standardized privacy policies to simplify it so you can look in just a few screens or a few icons so that the consumer really knows what they're giving up. Because when you're agreeing to something without having read it, if it's unreadable and unknowable, I'm certainly not suggesting people should read all these policies, but I think it demonstrates how things need to change because people are just agreeing to this blindly, and that's not true consent.
No, that's a point very well taken. So how about within a company now, a company that's trying to devise a policy, and this will take us to the end, we have a few minutes left, but for a company that's trying to devise a policy themselves, what might inform that? What would go into that in a reasonable way?
I think it should be transparent. I think it should be clear. I think it should be readable to the average person. I don't think you should have to read a paragraph 10 times to understand what it means. And I think employees, developers of software, people building products should understand what the policy says, and the customer should understand it as well. And if you can't make it transparent, if you can't make it clear and understandable, then you're working against the principle of these privacy policies, which is to give full disclosure so you get honest consent. I would like to think that transparency and openness about how data is being stored and used is something that customers will gravitate to, that they'll pick companies like that over the company that is less transparent or less truthful. But it needs to be understandable, it needs to be transparent, and needs to be updated periodically.
Yeah, no, you raise a good point, and this is something that might enter, the sort of competitiveness of the industrial world. If you're a consumer and you want to buy a product, you want a company that has a reputation for using your data well. If all else is equal, right, you'll choose that company and that product as opposed to that of a company that doesn't have as good a reputation or a history of data or using data in a way that wasn't consented to by the customer. So I think these are things that customers will be able to make choices about probably in the near future. That brings us to the end of our main presentation. I don't see any other questions submitted at this time. You still can submit one if you want. But let me note our contact information here. If you have additional questions for John, he's given you his email here, John Bandler at bandlergroup.com, and his LinkedIn profile as well. And you have my email address here at Yeshiva University. If anybody has further questions for us, you can always submit them offline to us, and we'll be happy to get back to you.